In May 1940, the German war machine was not just winning, it was rewriting the laws of physics on the battlefield. The French army, considered the finest in Europe, was dissolving under the tracks of the Panzers, and the British Expeditionary Force was being herded like cattle toward the sea. But amidst this catastrophe, a single command was issued, a decision so baffling that historians argue about it to this day. It was the moment the Germans blinked, and in that blink, the fate of the world changed. If you want to understand how the greatest army in history let victory slip through its fingers, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're going back to the desperate beaches of northern France. To understand the magnitude of this decision, we must first appreciate the sheer speed of the collapse. On May 10th, 1940, Germany launched Case Yellow. The Allies expected a replay of World War I, with a massive grind through Belgium. Instead, they got the sickle cut. General Erich von Manstein had convinced Hitler to send the bulk of his armored forces through the Ardennes Forest, a region of dense woods and hills that the French High Command had dismissed as impassable to tanks. The Allies moved their best armies north into Belgium to meet the fate, walking straight into the trap. Meanwhile, 7 Panzer divisions, led by the aggressive genius of Heinz, Guderian, and Erwin Rommel, burst out of the forest behind them. They crossed the Meuse River in a display of tactical brilliance that left the French defenders paralyzed. The speed was intoxicating. Guderian's tanks were moving so fast that they drove off the edges of their own maps. They weren't just defeating the enemy. They were ignoring them, racing for the coast to sever the Allied supply lines. By May 20th, Guderian's tanks reached the English Channel at Abbeville. The trap was shut. Over 400,000 Allied troops, the entire British Expeditionary Force, BF, and the best of the French First Army, were cut off from Paris and their supplies. They were trapped in a shrinking pocket along the coast, with their backs to the sea. The situation inside the pocket was apocalyptic. Command and control had broken down. Roads were clogged with terrified refugees fleeing the fighting, mixing with retreating military columns. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies, strafing anything that moved. To the German commanders on the ground, this was the moment of total victory. They could see the spires of Dunkirk in the distance. They had the British by the throat. All they had to do was close their hand. Guderian was poised to strike. His tanks were fueled. His men were high on victory, and the defenses in front of him were practically non-existent. The British were scrambling to set up a perimeter along the canal lines, but they had almost no anti-tank guns, and their communications were in tatters. A determined armored push on May 23rd or 24th would likely have overrun Dunkirk before the evacuation could even begin. But fear is a strange thing. While the Panzer generals saw an open door, the German High Command saw a ghost. They were terrified by their own success. They had advanced so far, so fast, that they felt exposed. They looked at the map and saw a long, thin corridor of German tanks stretching across France, vulnerable to a counterattack from the south or the north. They worried about the marshy terrain around Flanders, fearing it would bog down their precious armor. This anxiety began to trickle up the chain of command. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group A, was an old-school Prussian. He was cautious. He looked at the wear and tear on his tanks. Some divisions had lost up to 50% of their vehicles to mechanical breakdowns, and he wanted to pause. He wanted to rest the armor, let the infantry catch up, and secure the flanks. At the same time, Adolf Hitler was visiting the front. He was ecstatic about the victory, but also nervous. He had always feared that the miracle would turn into a nightmare if the French managed to organize a counterstroke like the miracle on the Marne in 1914. When Rundstedt suggested a pause to consolidate, Hitler didn't just agree, he seized upon it. On May 24th, the order went out. It wasn't a roar of conquest. It was a whisper of caution. The Panzers are to halt. Dunkirk is to be left to the Luftwaffe. To the men in the tanks, sitting just miles from the helpless British army, it was insanity. They turned off their engines and watched the smoke rise over the port, unaware that they had just been ordered to lose the war. Imagine standing on a dune, looking at the smoke of your burning equipment, knowing that the most powerful army in the world is parked just over the horizon, waiting to kill you. That was the reality for the British soldier in May 1940. But as a German tank sat idling, a different kind of battle was raging in London, a political battle that would determine if Britain would fight or surrender. Before we reveal the chaos inside the British government, hit that like button to support our deep dives into the hidden history of World War II. While the German tanks cooled their engines, the panic in London reached a fever pitch. We often look back at 1940 through the lens of victory, assuming that British resolve was unshakable. It was not. In late May 1940, Britain was on the verge of capitulation. Winston Churchill had been Prime Minister for only a few weeks. He was not yet the unassailable icon of bulldog spirit. Many in his own party distrusted him, viewing him as a reckless adventurer. The true power struggle was within the War Cabinet. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, was a pragmatist. He looked at the map, saw the fall of France as inevitable, saw the British army trapped, and concluded that the war was lost. Halifax argued that Britain should explore peace terms with Hitler, perhaps using Mussolini as a mediator. He believed that if they negotiated now, while they still had an army and a navy, they might preserve the independence of the UK and the integrity of the empire. If they fought on and were destroyed, they would lose everything. To a rational mind in May 1940, Halifax's argument made perfect sense. Churchill, however, knew that you cannot negotiate with a tiger when your head is in its mouth. He argued passionately that once they entered negotiations, the national morale would collapse, and they would never be able to fight again. He knew that the survival of his government and the nation depended on one thing: the salvation of the army at Dunkirk. If the BEF was captured or annihilated, Britain would be defenseless. There were almost no trained divisions left in England to repel an invasion. The equipment, the tanks, the heavy artillery, the trucks, was all in France. Without those 300,000 men, the war would be over. Back on the beaches, the situation was deteriorating. The German Halt Order had given the British a breathing space, but it was not a reprieve from hell. The Luftwaffe, commanded by the boastful Hermann Göring, had promised Hitler that the Air Force alone could destroy the trapped enemy. "My Luftwaffe will complete the encirclement and close the sack," Göring had bragged. So, while the tanks waited, the bombers attacked. Dunkirk was pounded into rubble. The oil refineries were set ablaze, creating a thick, black pall of smoke that hung over the town and the beaches. This smoke, ironically, would sometimes shield the troops from air attacks, but it also made the air acrid and choking. The discipline of the British Army was tested to its breaking point. Units were mixed up. Men had walked for days without food or sleep. They were destroying their own vehicles, smashing radios, and spiking guns to prevent them from falling into German hands. The beaches were becoming a graveyard of machinery. And yet, amidst the chaos, a defensive perimeter was forming. Taking advantage of the German delay, the British and French commanders rushed infantry to the canal lines. They dug in. They set up machine gun posts in farmhouses. They prepared to sell their lives dearly to buy time for an evacuation that seemed impossible. The British Admiralty had begun planning Operation Dynamo, but the initial estimates were terrifyingly bleak. They hoped to save perhaps 45,000 men. Maybe the Royal Navy could grab a few battalions before the Germans realized their mistake and crushed the pocket. No one dreamed of saving the whole army. As the soldiers waited on the sands, forming long, snaking lines into the water, they looked at the sky with a mixture of fear and anger. "Where's the RAF?" was a common cry. They didn't see the dogfights happening high above the clouds or inland, where British Spitfires and Hurricanes were desperately trying to intercept the German bombers. To the men on the beach, they felt abandoned, sitting ducks in a shooting gallery, unaware that their survival hung on a decision made by their enemy to stop the tanks. The Halt Order is often misunderstood as a simple mistake, but it was actually a collision of ego, outdated doctrine, and the fog of war. While the British dug in, the German generals were screaming into their radios, watching the greatest prize in history slip away. This is the story of the 48 hours that saved the free world. If you want to join our community of history enthusiasts dissecting these critical moments, make sure you are subscribed. Let's analyze why the order was given. It wasn't just Hitler. Field Marshal von Rundstedt was genuinely concerned about his tanks. The terrain around Flanders is crisscrossed with canals, drainage ditches, and marshland. It is not good tank country. Rundstedt remembered the mud of World War I. He feared that if he sent his Panzers into that bog, they would get stuck and be picked off by British anti-tank guns. Furthermore, the Germans were obsessed with their flanks. They had driven a narrow wedge across France. To the south lay the main French army. To the north, the British. They terrified themselves with the idea that the Allies would launch a simultaneous attack from north and south, snipping off the Panzer's spearhead. In reality, the Allies were too disorganized to do this, but the Germans didn't know that. They were fighting the ghosts of their own anxiety. Then there was Hermann Göring. The head of the Luftwaffe was a World War I ace, a morphine addict, and a man of colossal vanity. He was jealous of the army's success. The generals were getting all the glory. Göring wanted to share the victory. He approached Hitler and argued that the annihilation of the British at Dunkirk should be a Luftwaffe show. "Let me finish them off," he urged. Hitler, who was always suspicious of the aristocratic army generals and preferred the Nazi-aligned Luftwaffe, agreed. It was a political decision as much as a military one. By giving the job to Göring, Hitler kept the army in check and stroked the ego of his second-in-command. It was a fatal hubris. On the ground, the reaction of the Panzer commanders was volcanic. Heinz Guderian was speechless. He could see the port. He knew the British were reeling. To stop now was criminal. He sent messages up the chain of command, practically begging to be unleashed. "We are wasting time," he argued. "The enemy is escaping." For 2 days, May 24th to May 26th, the tanks sat. The crews performed maintenance. They slept. They watched the smoke. And in those 2 days, the British moved. They solidified the canal line defenses. They brought up the French First Army to hold the city of Lille, creating a roadblock that would tie up German forces for days. The weather also played a role. The same Luftwaffe weather that would later doom the Germans in the Battle of the Bulge worked against them here. The skies over Flanders were not always clear. Low clouds and smoke from the burning oil tanks obscured the targets. Göring's bombers couldn't kill everyone. They could terrorize. They could destroy ships. But they couldn't wipe out 300,000 men dug into the sand dunes. By the time Hitler realized his mistake and rescinded the Halt Order on May 26, the window had closed. The British defense had hardened. The terrain had been flooded in places by the defenders. When the tanks finally rolled forward again, they didn't meet a routed rabble. They met a desperate, dug-in rear guard fighting for survival of their country. The fighting was savage. The British battalions holding the perimeter knew they were being sacrificed. They were told to hold the line to the last round and the last man. And they did. At places like Luperdi and Wormhout, British troops fought until they were overrun, and in some tragic cases, massacred by SS units after surrendering. But their sacrifice bought time. The Halt Order had given the Royal Navy just enough breathing room to organize the impossible. The miracle was not just about boats. It was about the time gifted by the enemy. While the German tanks ground their gears against the stiffening British resistance, a different kind of armada was assembling across the channel. It wasn't a fleet of warships, but a ragtag collection of ferries, fishing boats, and pleasure yachts. Operation Dynamo was about to begin, and it would turn a military disaster into a psychological victory. Don't forget to hit subscribe to hear more stories of resilience against the odds. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay commanded Operation Dynamo from a tunnel deep within the White Cliffs of Dover. The challenge was logistical madness. Dunkirk's harbor had been smashed by the Luftwaffe. The docks were unusable. The only place big ships could dock was the East Mole, a long, concrete breakwater that extended a mile out to sea. It wasn't designed for loading troops. It was a wave break, but it became the lifeline of the British Army. Ramsay realized that the destroyers and transport ships couldn't get close enough to the shallow beaches to pick up the men. He needed small craft to act as shuttles, ferrying soldiers in the sands to the big ships waiting in deeper water. The call went out. The British Ministry of Shipping began requisitioning every vessel that could float. This was the birth of the little ships. Lifeboats, barges, paddle steamers, private yachts, Fireboats. Anything with shallow draft was seized or volunteered. Civilian crews, often accompanied by a naval officer, sailed straight into a war zone. The scene they sailed into was hellish. The sea was full of mines and wrecks. The air was full of Stukas screaming down in vertical dives. The water was choked with oil and bodies. Yet, the little ships kept coming. They would run into the beach, load up with shivering, oil-soaked soldiers, ferry them to a destroyer, and go back for more. On the East Mole, the discipline was absolute. Thousands of men stood in neat columns on the narrow concrete walkway, exposed to strafing and bombing, waiting their turn. When a ship docked, they boarded calmly. When a ship was hit and sank, those who survived swam back to the mole and rejoined the back of the queue. The Royal Navy destroyers took a beating. Ships like the HMS Wakeful, HMS Grafton, and HMS Grenade were sunk. The losses were heavy. The Admiralty panicked, at one point withdrawing the modern destroyers because they feared losing the entire fleet needed to defend against the inevitable invasion of England. But Ramsay argued them back. He knew they couldn't leave the army to die. The Luftwaffe tried everything to stop the evacuation. They dropped magnetic mines. They bombed the mole. They strafed the beaches. But they failed. They failed because the Halt Order had given the British time to establish a dense anti-aircraft screen. They failed because the RAF, flying from bases in Kent, contested the airspace with ferocity the Germans hadn't expected. And they failed because the sheer number of small targets baffled the pilots. It's hard to sink 1,000 tiny boats with dive bombers. The miracle of Dunkirk was a miracle of logistics and improvisation. It was a triumph of the civilian spirit. But it was only possible because the German army had been held on a leash for those critical 48 hours. Had the tanks been on the beaches on May 24th, the little ships would have arrived to find nothing but German flags. The evacuation of Dunkirk was not a single event. It was 9 days of agony and heroism. As the days ticked by, the numbers rose. 10,000 saved, then 25,000, then 45,000 in a single day. The impossible was happening. But for the men left on the perimeter, holding the line against the rejuvenated German advance, the war was ending in captivity or death. Before we look at the legacy of this decision, make sure you are subscribed to our channel. We must remember the French. The evacuation is often remembered as a British miracle, but it was paid for with French blood. As the British retreated to the boats, it was largely the French First Army that held the siege of Lille and the perimeter around Dunkirk. General Moligny's French troops fought until their ammunition ran out. They tied down 7 German divisions, forces that could have been used to crush the beachhead. When they finally surrendered, the Germans were so impressed by their resistance that they granted them full military honors, marching past them in salute. 40,000 French troops were taken prisoner to allow the British to escape. On the beaches, the scenes were surreal. Soldiers played cricket on the sand to pass the time while being bombed. They shot stray dogs to prevent them from starving. They built piers out of driven trucks to reach the boats. The exhaustion was so deep that men slept through bombardments. By June 4th, the last ship left. The destroyer HMS Shikari pulled away at 3:40 a.m. Behind them, the docks were burning, and the Germans were finally swarming over Mole. 338,226 Allied soldiers had been rescued. It was a number that defied all logic. But they left behind everything else. The beaches of Dunkirk were littered with the wreckage of the British Army. 63,000 vehicles, 2,400 artillery guns, 500,000 tons of supplies. The British Army returned to England with their rifles and their lives, but naked in terms of heavy equipment. Hitler and the German High Command tried to spin it as a great victory. They had, after all, kicked the British off the continent and conquered France. "We have won the war," Hitler reportedly said. He believed that Britain, humiliated and disarmed, would now sue for peace. He expected Churchill to realize the hopelessness of the situation. This was the second great miscalculation stemming from a Halt Order. Hitler thought Dunkirk was the end. He didn't realize that by letting the men escape, he had ensured the war would continue. He had saved the cadre of the British Army. The sergeants, the corporals, the officers. These were the men who would train the new conscripts. These were the men who would fight in North Africa, in Italy, and eventually return to France. If those 338,000 men had marched into German POW camps in 1940, Britain would have lacked the manpower to defend its own shores, let alone launch an offensive. The Halt Order didn't just save an army. It saved the political will of the British Empire. The smoke cleared over Dunkirk, revealing a beach strewn with debris and the silence of a great escape. The Germans stood on the cliffs of France, masters of Europe. Looking across the narrow strip of water at the white cliffs of Dover, they had won the battle. But thanks to a single moment of hesitation, they had lost the war. To understand how this decision echoed through history to D-Day and beyond, ensure you're subscribed for our final analysis. On June 4th, Winston Churchill addressed the House of Commons. He didn't sugarcoat the disaster. He called it a colossal military disaster. But then he delivered the speech that mobilized the English language for war. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender. The Dunkirk spirit became the defining myth of the British war effort. It turned a catastrophic defeat into a moral victory. It galvanized the population. The fact that the army had survived was seen as a sign of divine providence, a signal that the cause was just. Strategically, the survival of the BEF meant that Britain remained a fortress. It forced Hitler to contemplate an amphibious invasion, Operation Cillian, which the German Navy and Army were ill-equipped to execute. It forced him to fight the Battle of Britain in the air, a battle he lost. And because Britain stayed in the war, it became the unsinkable aircraft carrier for the United States. It became the staging ground for the bomber offensive that pulverized German cities. It became the launching pad for D-Day. For years later, on June 6, 1944, many of the same men who had waded into the water at Dunkirk, terrified and defeated, waded back onto the beaches of Normandy. But this time, they had tanks. They had air superiority. They had the Americans with them. If the Panzers had not halted on May 24, 1940, there would have been no D-Day. There would have been no British army to storm gold and sword beaches. The geopolitical map of the world would look radically different today. The Halt Order remains the supreme irony of World War II. It was a decision born of the fear of losing a victory, which ultimately ensured that the victory could never be total. It was a moment the Nazi regime proved that for all its tactical brilliance, it lacked the strategic vision to close the deal. Hitler wanted to avoid a mistake, so he made the biggest one of all. He let his enemy live, and that enemy, battered and bruised, walked out of the surf at Dunkirk, shook the sand off his boots, and prepared for the long, hard road back to Berlin. Thank you for watching this series on the decision that changed the war forever. If you want to know about the other side of the channel, and how the Germans prepared for an invasion that never came, click the video on your screen now. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share history.